The Pacific wind carried the salt and the cold, whipping across the gray water and slamming against the worn clapboard of the house. Leo Cassaday sat on his porch, a thick wool blanket draped over his legs, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky met the sea. The chair beside him, a matching Adirondack, remained empty, a permanent monument to his late wife, Sarah. For 5 years, that chair had held only rain and dust. Leo's life had narrowed to this single point: the porch, the view, the silence. He was a man built of routine now, a stark contrast to the man he used to be. For 30 years, he had been a detective with the Harbor City Police Department, a man known for his relentless pursuit of the truth. He had seen the worst of people, and it had shaped him, hardened him. But it was the one thing he couldn't uncover that had eventually broken him. Retirement wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The unsolved ate at a man, and in Leo's case, one case in particular had consumed him from the inside out. He rarely spoke of it anymore. The file was buried deep, both physically in a box in the attic and mentally in a vault he tried desperately to keep sealed. The only sound was the rhythmic groan of the porch swing and the distant cry of gulls, a monotonous soundtrack to his self-imposed exile. He was waiting, though he wouldn't admit it. Waiting for the days to pass, for the pain to lessen, for something he couldn't name. He never expected that something to come in the form of a rental car kicking up gravel on his long, winding driveway. The car, a sleek silver sedan that looked entirely out of place in the rustic landscape, pulled to a stop. The door opened, and Maya stepped out, a gust of wind whipping her dark hair across her face. She was the one point of light in Leo's gray world, a stubborn, vibrant presence that refused to let him fade away entirely. At 32, she was a successful occupational therapist in the bustling city of Ashford, hours away from this isolated coast. She carried with her the energy of that other world, a world of schedules and people and purpose. Her smile as she approached the porch was wide, but her eyes, sharp and observant like her father's, missed nothing. She saw the untouched lunch plate on the small table beside him, the way his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the blanket. She leaned in to kiss his cheek, her voice warm but firm as she commented on his lack of eating. Leo grunted, a non-committal sound that was his primary form of communication these days. They sat in silence for a moment, the wind the only bridge between them. Maya talked about her work, a challenging patient who was finally making progress, a new cafe that had opened near her apartment. Leo watched her, noticing the tiny lines of worry that had begun to form around her eyes, lines he suspected he was responsible for. This visit, she announced as the afternoon light began to fade, wasn't just a social call. She was staying the weekend, and she was determined to do something about the state of the house. Her mission, as she jokingly called it, was twofold: to check on her father's health and to tackle the clutter that had accumulated. For Leo, her presence was a bomb and a disruption. It forced him to engage, to pull himself out of the comfortable fog of solitude. He didn't know which feeling was stronger, the love he felt for her, or the deep, gnawing fear that he was somehow holding her back from a fuller life. Saturday morning arrived with a pale, watery sun that did little to warm the house. True to her word, Maya had already made coffee and was eyeing the attic door with the determined look of someone about to wage war on clutter. Leo watched from the kitchen table as she pulled the cord that released the folding stairs, a cloud of dust and the smell of cold air drifting down. He knew exactly what was up there. He heard her moving around, the shuffling of boxes, a small cough. Then, a silence that stretched a beat too long. Her voice floated down, curious, asking about boxes of files. He didn't answer, but he heard her footsteps on the ladder. She came down carefully, struggling with a heavy, dust-covered cardboard box. She set it on the kitchen floor, the thud it made heavy with consequence. Kneeling, she blew dust from the lid. In faded marker, it simply said, CC. Leo stared at the box as if it contained a live animal. Maya looked from the box to her father, a question in her eyes. Coast collector, Leo said, his voice rough, as if he hadn't used it in days. That's what the press called him. Before my time on the force officially ended. He didn't move to stop her as she carefully lifted the lid. Inside were neat stacks of files, photographs, and evidence logs. Maya pulled out a photograph. It showed a smiling young man with a forgettable face. Underneath it was another, a young woman. Page after page of missing persons reports, timelines, and dead ends. 23 names in total. Young adults, drifters, runaways, people on the fringes of society who vanished from the coastal highways over a span of 5 years. Leo nodded slowly, his gaze distant. He spoke of the meticulous pattern, the lack of any physical evidence, the way the disappearances simply stopped. He spoke of the 23 families he had to face, 23 times he had to say he had no answers. And as he spoke, a ghost of the old Leo flickered in his tired eyes, a spark Maya hadn't seen in a very long time. Over the next hour, the kitchen table was transformed into a war room for a war long since ended. Maya, captivated and horrified, listened as her father laid out the pieces of the puzzle. He explained that the collector wasn't a monster in the shadows, but likely a friendly face. A truck driver, maybe, or a traveling salesman. Someone who could offer a ride, a warm meal, a job. He targeted the invisible ones, the ones no one would look for too hard. Leo showed her the only composite sketch they ever managed to create, based on a vague recollection from a gas station attendant who thought he saw one of the missing girls getting into a dark-colored van. It was a generic face, a ghost. They had nothing. No bodies, no witnesses, no forensics. Just a void where 23 people used to be. He pointed to the dates on the timeline. For 5 years, the disappearances continued. Then, nothing. As if he knew they were getting too close, though they never were. The case went cold, then frozen. It was the defining failure of Leo's career, the reason he couldn't look at himself in the mirror the same way afterward. Maya listened in silence, her fingers tracing the edges of the old photographs. She asked what made him stop. Leo shook his head slowly. He didn't stop. The department did. Resources were pulled, priorities shifted. New cases demanded attention. But Leo never stopped. He worked on it in the shadows of other investigations, on weekends, on his own time. He drove the coastal highways, talked to everyone who would listen, chased every whisper. Until the day he realized he was chasing ghosts. Maya looked at the box, then at her father. She saw the weight he carried, the burden of 23 names etched into his soul. She gently closed the lid, but something had shifted in the room. The past was no longer just buried in the attic. It was sitting at the table with them, breathing the same air. Sunday came and went in a blur of quiet companionship. Maya helped with small repairs around the house, cooked a proper meal, and filled the silence with stories from her life. But Leo noticed that her gaze would occasionally drift to the box, now sitting on a shelf in the hallway, a dark sentinel watching their every move. Before she left on Monday morning, Maya stood by the box, hesitating. She asked if she could take one of the photographs. Not a file, just one of the older pictures of the missing. Leo was surprised by the request. He asked why. Maya shrugged, a thoughtful expression on her face. She said it wasn't healthy for him to carry this alone. Maybe, she suggested, having someone else look at it, someone from a different generation, might offer a fresh perspective. Or maybe she just wanted a piece of his world, a way to understand the weight he carried. Leo considered it for a long moment. Part of him wanted to refuse, to keep the case sealed away where it couldn't hurt anyone else. But another part, a part he thought had died long ago, recognized the sincerity in her request. He nodded slowly. Maya carefully selected one photograph, a black and white image of a young man with tired eyes and a faint smile. She tucked it into her bag, kissed her father goodbye, and promised to call when she arrived home. Leo watched her car disappear down the driveway, a familiar emptiness settling back into the house. He didn't know it then, but that single photograph was a thread. A thread that would connect his past to his present in ways he could never have imagined. A thread that was about to be pulled, unraveling everything he thought he knew. 10 days passed. Leo returned to his routine, but something was different. The silence felt heavier now, punctuated by thoughts of Maya and the case. He found himself glancing at the box in the hallway, the ghost of the old detective stirring restlessly within him. He almost called Maya several times, just to hear her voice, but he didn't want to seem needy. Then, on a Tuesday night, the phone rang. It was past 11, an hour when phone calls brought only dread. Leo's hand trembled as he reached for the receiver. It wasn't Maya. It was a detective from the Ashford Police Department. His name was Detective Mark Ramsey, and his voice was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of hope. He asked if Leo was the father of Maya Cassaday. Leo's blood ran cold. He confirmed, his voice barely a whisper. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that precedes the destruction of a life. Ramsey informed him that Maya was dead. She had been found in her apartment earlier that evening. The initial investigation suggested a robbery gone wrong. There were signs of a struggle, and some valuable items were missing. Leo's world stopped. He didn't hear the rest of the sentence. He didn't hear the condolences or the instructions. He only heard the word dead echoing in his skull, bouncing off the walls of the empty house. He hung up the phone and sat in the dark for hours, the weight of the news pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. The one point of light in his gray world had been extinguished. And in the depths of his grief, a single, sharp thought pierced through the fog, a robbery gone wrong. In Maya's quiet, secure building. It didn't feel right. Leo made the drive to Ashford in a daze, the miles of highway blurring past him in a gray streak. He barely remembered the journey. He only knew he had to see her, to be where she had been, to understand how the world had shifted so violently. The Ashford PD was courteous but firm. Detective Ramsey, a solid man in his 40s with weary eyes, met him at the station. He expressed his condolences again, then walked Leo through the official version of events. Maya had been found by her landlord after a neighbor complained of a disturbance. The apartment had been ransacked. Her wallet and some electronics were missing. There was no sign of forced entry, suggesting she may have known her attacker or simply forgot to lock the door. It was a tragic, senseless crime, the kind that happened every day in a city this size. Leo listened, nodding mechanically. But his detective's mind, dormant for years, was waking up. He asked to see the apartment. Ramsey hesitated, citing the active investigation, but ultimately agreed, perhaps out of respect for a fellow officer. The moment Leo stepped through the door of Maya's home, his senses were flooded with her presence. Her books, her plants, the faint scent of her perfume. And amidst it all, the chaos of the struggle. A overturned chair, drawers pulled out, cushions tossed aside. It looked like a robbery. It looked exactly like a robbery. Leo walked through the room slowly, his eyes missing nothing. He opened drawers, examined the mess, tried to reconstruct the sequence of events in his mind. And then he saw it. A small, framed photograph on her desk, knocked face down. He picked it up. It was a picture of the two of them, taken years ago on this very beach near his home. But it wasn't the photograph that made his heart stop. It was what was beside it. On the desk, partially hidden by a stack of mail, was a small digital camera. Maya's camera. Leo picked it up, his hands trembling. He turned it on, scrolling through the recent photos. There were pictures of her patient's artwork, a new haircut, a sunset from her window. Ordinary snapshots of an ordinary life. Then he came to a series of photos taken at what looked like a local street fair. Booths, crowds, a band playing in the distance. And then, a photo of a man. He was in profile, partially turned away, as if Maya had taken the picture without him knowing. Perhaps she was just documenting the crowd, and he happened to be in the frame. Leo stared at the image. The man was middle-aged, with graying hair and a forgettable face. He could have been anyone. A vendor, a bystander, a father. Leo was about to scroll past when something caught his eye. A small, dark mark on the man's neck, just above his collar. It was an irregular shape, like a small birthmark or an old scar. Leo's breath caught in his throat. He pulled out his phone, his fingers clumsy with urgency. He opened the digital copies of the old case files he had brought with him. He scrolled through the photographs, the evidence logs, the witness statements. And there it was. Buried in an old report from a gas station attendant who had seen one of the missing girls. A detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it had been buried in the case file and forgotten for 25 years. The attendant mentioned that the driver of the van had a distinctive mark on his neck. A small, dark mark. Leo looked from the camera screen to his phone, then back again. The same shape. The same location. The world tilted on its axis. Maya hadn't been the victim of a random robbery. Maya had crossed paths with the collector. And the collector had crossed paths with her. The past had not stayed buried. It had reached out from the grave of cold cases and taken his daughter. Leo didn't call Detective Ramsey. Not yet. He knew how it would sound. An old, retired detective, consumed by grief, claiming a random photo from his dead daughter's camera was connected to a 25-year-old cold case. They would see a broken man grasping at conspiracy theories to make sense of a senseless tragedy. He needed proof. He needed to be sure. Leo checked into a small motel near Maya's apartment and spent the night studying the photograph. He enhanced it on his laptop, zooming in on the man's face, the mark on his neck. He compared it to every scrap of information in the old case files. There were no photographs of the suspect, only the vague composite sketch. But the mark was there, documented in black and white in a witness statement. It was a thread, thin and fragile, but it was the only thread he had. The next morning, he returned to Maya's building. He spoke to her neighbors, the landlord, anyone who would listen. He described the man in the photograph, the man with the mark. Most people shook their heads. But one elderly woman in the ground floor apartment remembered something. She had seen Maya talking to a man in the parking lot a few weeks ago. A middle-aged man, driving an older model truck. She didn't get a good look at his face, but she remembered the truck because it had out-of-state plates. Leo's heart pounded. He asked if she remembered which state. She thought for a moment, then shook her head. But she remembered the color. A faded green. It was another thread. A truck. Out-of-state plates. Faded green. Leo drove back to his motel, his mind racing. The collector had evolved. He was older now, smarter. But he had made a mistake. He had let Maya see his face. And now, Leo had something he never had before, a face to hunt. Leo knew he was operating outside the law. He had no authority, no resources, no backup. But he had something more powerful, 30 years of experience and a father's desperate rage. He began where any good detective would, with the photograph. He traced the street fair where it was taken. It was an annual event in a small town called Millbrook, about an hour from Ashford. He drove there, showing the photograph to every vendor, every organizer, everyone who would look. Most people shrugged. But a woman selling handmade candles recognized the man. She didn't know his name, but she remembered him because he bought a candle every year. Always the same scent. Sandalwood. She pointed Leo toward a nearby campground where many of the out-of-town vendors and visitors stayed during the fair. Leo drove to the campground, a quiet, wooded area with scattered RV sites and tent pitches. The owner, a grizzled old man named Frank, was initially reluctant to talk. But Leo's quiet intensity, the pain evident in his eyes, persuaded him. Frank checked his old records. A man matching the description had stayed at the campground during the fair. He paid in cash, registered under the name David Miller. A generic name, almost certainly false. But Frank remembered something else. The man drove an old green truck. And he mentioned, in passing, that he lived up the coast, near a town called Rocky Point. Rocky Point. It was a small, isolated fishing community north of Harbor City. Leo's old stomping grounds. The collector had been living in his backyard all along. Leo drove to Rocky Point without hesitation. It was a 2-day journey up the winding coastal highway, the same highway where 23 people had vanished decades ago. He barely stopped, surviving on coffee and the burning fuel of vengeance. Rocky Point was a stark, beautiful place. Jagged cliffs, crashing waves, a handful of weathered houses clinging to the rocks. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear. He started at the local post office, showing the photograph to the elderly postmaster. The man squinted at the image, then nodded slowly. He knew him. Everyone knew him. His name was Daniel Cross. He lived alone in a small house at the end of North Point Road. Kept to himself. Worked as a handyman, odd jobs up and down the coast. A quiet man. A friendly man. Leo felt a cold certainty settle over him. Daniel Cross. A new name for an old evil. He drove to North Point Road, his old sedan struggling on the rough, unpaved track. The house at the end was small and weathered, just like the others. And in the driveway, partially covered by a tarp, was an old green truck. Leo parked at a distance, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had found him. After 25 years, he had found the collector. But now what? He was a 70-year-old man with no badge and no weapon. The man in that house was a predator, a killer. And Leo was alone. Leo didn't call the police. Not yet. He needed to be sure. He needed to hear it from the man himself. He approached the house slowly, his footsteps silent on the soft ground. The wind howled off the ocean, carrying the spray and the salt. He knocked on the door. A long moment passed. Then the door creaked open. Daniel Cross stood in the doorway, older than the photograph, but unmistakably the same man. He had kind eyes and a gentle smile. The perfect mask. He asked if he could help. Leo introduced himself as a lost traveler, his car having trouble. A lie, thin and transparent. But Daniel Cross, the friendly handyman, invited him in for coffee. It was his nature, his cover. Leo stepped inside. The house was sparse but tidy. A wood stove crackled in the corner. On a shelf, Leo saw a collection of small, hand-carved wooden birds. And beside them, a candle. Sandalwood. They sat at the small kitchen table. Daniel poured coffee, his movements calm and unhurried. Leo's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. And then he saw it. On a small side table, partially hidden by a book, was a photograph. It was Maya. A candid shot, taken from a distance, showing her walking down a street in Ashford. Leo's blood turned to ice. Daniel followed his gaze. The smile on his face didn't waver, but his eyes changed. They became flat, empty. He asked if Leo knew her. Leo's voice was steady, though his hands trembled beneath the table. He said she was his daughter. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the moan of the wind. Daniel Cross looked at him, the mask slipping entirely. He didn't deny it. He didn't run. He simply nodded slowly. He said she was a kind woman. She had tried to help him. He had seen her at the street fair, and then again in Ashford. He hadn't planned it. But she had looked at him, really looked at him. And he couldn't have that. So he had followed her home. Leo stared into the face of the man who had killed his daughter, the man who had haunted his life for 25 years. The weight of silence finally broke. Leo didn't remember standing up. He didn't remember the chair clattering to the floor behind him. He only remembered the look in Daniel Cross's eyes as he lunged across the table. There was no fear there, only a terrible, empty calm. The struggle was brief and brutal. Leo was old, driven by grief and rage, but Cross was younger, stronger, and utterly without mercy. He overpowered Leo easily, slamming him against the wall, his hands closing around his throat. Leo gasped for air, his vision dimming. In that final moment, he thought of Maya. Her smile. Her voice. The way she had looked at him with love and worry. He thought of Sarah, waiting for him somewhere beyond this world. And he thought of the 23 names in that box, the families who had never gotten justice. He had failed them. He had failed Maya. But as the darkness closed in, a new sound erupted. The crash of the front door bursting open. Shouts. The thunder of boots. Detective Ramsey and a team of state police swarmed the room. Ramsey, it turned out, had believed Leo. Not at first. But after Leo disappeared, after he learned about the cold case from old colleagues who remembered the collector, he had put the pieces together. He had tracked Leo's rental car to Rocky Point. Daniel Cross released his grip, his hands raised in surrender, the mask of the friendly handyman sliding back into place. He would claim self-defense. He would deny everything. But in the chaos, as the officers handcuffed him, Ramsay crossed the room to where Leo lay gasping on the floor. He knelt beside him, his face grim. He told Leo they had found them in a locked shed behind the house. Photographs, keepsakes, evidence spanning decades. 23 names, and Maya's face among them. The collector's trophy room. Leo closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. The case was closed. The monster was caught. But the silence that followed was heavier than any that had come before. It was the weight of justice, finally served. And the weight of a daughter, forever gone. Leo Cassaday had found his answer. And in finding it, he had lost everything. But as they lifted him to his feet and led him out into the cold Pacific air, he looked up at the gray sky and felt, for the first time in 25 years, the faintest glimmer of peace. The weight of silence had finally been lifted. But it would never, ever be filled.